into handling skill specialization as an engineering leader. The words engineering leader are a little misleading because this talk is designed really for anybody who is a senior engineer or a principal or any type of IC or EM leader. Actually, do we have any EMs in the audience or anyone who has been an EM in the past? Oh, that's a good amount. Okay, awesome. The good news is also, disregard the fact that there is a stage and a mic. It's a little bit weird, but we are going to have a discussion today. This talk is designed to be very interruptible, so I encourage people, if you have a train of thought or comment or question, come up to the mic and I will make time to do a Q&A. All right, so what are we really talking about when we're talking about mobile skill specialization? I'm going to illustrate that with the story of how I have gone through my Android career. So when I started as a developer about 12 years ago, I actually did not want to be an Android developer. I was planning to work on software that runs in smart cars. And then I quickly realized that the best way to interface with a smart car at that time was to either get your hands on a car, that was out, I didn't have one, or actually get a phone and use the Bluetooth protocol. And so that's what I did. And that required learning a lot about how, first of all, how vehicles build computer systems, and how do they create systems for communicating outside of the vehicle, and it's actually very simplistic. You know, there's a single thing called a CAN bus, which is the communication line from the engine and other systems in your automotive systems to the outside world. And then there was Bluetooth protocols involved. And then at the top layer, you have sort of your Android app, because that's what I chose to interface with. And that requires learning a lot about how low-level systems communications works. It also requires learning about sort of the industry that you're in which my case was the car industry, and how each car manufacturer decides to implement what is supposed to be a standard protocol but is actually not a standard protocol. It's whatever Toyota decides to do with its cars or whatever BMW wants to do with its cars, and they go invent their own sort of quote-unquote operating system that runs in each of their cars. And then after that, I decided that I really liked the Android part of the job also, and I went and got a job at Comcast, where among other things, I was one of the first people to start building a design system, because up until then, we realized everyone had implemented UI their own way. We just looked at the designs and we just gave it our best shot and wrote everything in XML. And so we needed some standard design system, so I started building our tokens. And after that, when I joined Square, I started working on framework-style code, and that was a lot of work around realizing that our feature developers are slowed down by having to build things like authentication or building things like our core navigation system. And so if you're hearing this, you're probably realizing, wow, all of these things are now actually specialized career tracks within mobile engineering. And that makes sense because Android has actually matured quite a lot. And as companies have grown, as they have added more and more engineers, as their code bases have gotten older and larger and more complicated, we realized the fact that having people dedicated to a single problem area and becoming experts in that particular domain actually adds a lot of engineering efficiency to the entire org and to the entire business. And so as of today, there's a lot of different specialized career tracks that exist within mobile engineering itself. So you might just be your full stack Android engineer, but you could also be a design system specialist, or very commonly you could be a build engineer where you specialize in building tooling or in CI to speed up build times, to speed up IDEs and other tooling for software engineers. Or you could be a performance specialist and be really, really good at analytics and benchmarking and profiling, and generally getting low level into app performance. And so all of these things exist for a reason, right? This is the answer to the industry's problem of we need more efficiency and at the business level. And some companies have chosen to do this, and some companies have chosen not to do this with alternative solutions, and we can talk about all of that today. And really, at its core, for the engineer, it's a lot about what skills am I interested in developing, what is the day-to-day job that I want to focus on. And for the hiring manager or for the organization leader, it's a lot about what engineering skills do we want to invest in and that do we want to hire for to achieve the business goals that we have in mind, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about what these skill sets are, how they generally function in a business, in a mobile organization, sort of the double-edged sword it creates for hiring and training purposes, all of that. Okay. So one thing to note is that specialization is kind of the answer to complexity at scale. And this can be at scale, meaning more engineers. Suddenly you have an org of, you went from a team of 5 to a team of 15 or a team of 20 plus, and then you have these really large orgs that are like 100 plus, right? And so when you have that many people, it becomes a little bit inefficient to have everybody solving the same problems in their own way, and then you decide to have one person in charge of one problem for everybody else. Specialization can be scaling in terms of more screens and more users, and then you realize that there's certain problem sets that you keep running into over and over again, and having a dedicated team relegated to that becomes just the most efficient solution. And that's how you start to have an org that looks like your typical org. You have feature teams, you have platform teams, you have tooling teams, and all of these teams have their own particular ownership. They have their own customer base, which could be the end user or other developers or other people within the org. They have their own hiring practices and I think training. The scope of ownership, the scope of responsibilities varies a lot based on which team you're placed in. And so for an engineer, I think the interesting question is, sometimes you end up on these teams by accident, and sometimes you realize that this is a particular track that you want to continue going down. And this has actually been a process of discovery for the industry because, again, like mobile DevOps didn't really exist 8 or 10 years ago, unless maybe you were at a really, really large company or something like that. So there's a lot of trade-offs for the individual, there's trade-offs for hiring managers, there's trade-offs for somebody running multiple teams at this level. There's also the interesting case that sometimes the business or the industry that you're in decides this problem for you. And so this, as an example, so of course in Android there's a whole giant section of the industry that's dedicated to IoT, the Internet of Things, and this is usually a company's proprietary hardware or product that they're selling, and that is the core product, right? They're selling a physical thing to users, and usually the app itself is the user interface, the user's way of controlling the device. And so it's typically free. It's something that's considered, quote unquote, an add-on, but it's something that's really critical to use because guess what? These days, devices don't often come with physical manipulative controls. You usually need to have an app or an intelligent sort of surface that gives the users a lot more control over what you can do. So think about things like the Hatch nightlight system, which is also like an alarm clock, and it's a lighting system, and it has sound systems, and it has a lot of complex logic. And your app is responsible for controlling the hardware that's in people's houses, because of course at that point the company has no control over this anymore. And so what you want is an engineer who understands not just how to build an app, but also how the app functions with an object that is isolated from tech support. Hatch is not going to send an engineer out to your house if your alarm clock starts malfunctioning. It's just not worth the cost. And so the app developer has to understand this. You have to understand low-level device protocols, like how does Bluetooth communication work? How does that company's proprietary hardware work specifically? And so all of this is one giant part of like the industry as a whole. Like this is where a huge demand for Android engineers comes from. And it can be something as small as like these IoT devices up to cars, as I mentioned, and even things like giant screen interfaces that exist in exhibition spaces or airplanes. All of these things, everything that you can think of has run Android at some point. So if you're in an industry or in a company that is in that sector, chances are that has decided a lot of your specialized skill set for you. You are going to have to learn about the hardware, like it or not, right? There's also companies that are so large that they are starting to invent their own non-standard systems. So this is your Google, this is your Facebook, this is your Amazon, where your set of engineers is so enormous, and the demands of your product are so non-standard that you are creating non-standard systems to handle it. So in that case, you are essentially being forced to develop a skill set that is particular to the context that you work in, right? And so it's sometimes by choice and sometimes by no choice. You kind of have to become the engineer that you need to be in that moment. And what I've seen happen, interestingly, is that over the years, people have actually developed this affinity for a particular skill set. So often now that people are posting themselves, describing themselves as not just an Android engineer, but a build engineer or a design system expert. And now what I'm seeing these days is that it impacts hiring quite a lot. So often for job descriptions or roles, you're starting to see that specified very clearly, that you will be on X team working on XYZ product. And obviously hiring is, again, a huge, huge deal because these days, it's not the case that you would be, these days the industry is not looking for generalists, right? They're hiring for somebody who has had that work experience before. You're hiring specialists. And so the choice of whether to become a specialist or not also has impacts on where you can get a job. It's not just about, well, I have been a build engineer at X company, but I want to be on the market as a generalist. That contract has changed a little bit in recent years as the hiring market has changed. So how do we want to dig into skill specialization? I'm going to start with talking about things from the IC perspective, and I do invite people, anybody who's had experience working in a very specialized niche, to ask questions or share an experience here, because I know that is very common in mobile. And then I will switch over to a little bit more of a higher level overview of somebody who's hiring or trying to balance these roles from something bigger than the individual level, so at the team or at the organization level. So how does a specialist career track impact your long-term growth, your leadership opportunities, and adaptability? This is not a question that has like a clear answer, because I think a lot of it depends on things that are outside of an individual's control, right? We talked a little bit about business needs and industry needs. At some level, you have the choice of like, okay, well, I am really interested in joining the IoT industry. I like working with physical objects, for example. And that can be personal choice, but the constraints of the job itself are going to create that career track for you. And other things, I know people like me who have decided to work on design systems and built out some part of it, and then decided that, hey, this is a little too specialized and want to go back to being more of a generalist engineer. And so that trade-off, I think, a lot of it is in the hands of the IC. It can be good or bad. For hiring and jobs in general, it depends on if you prefer to be in a niche or not. Demand can be really high. I remember that after I spent a few years working on my work with in the auto industry, I ended up getting a lot of job offers for many, many years after that, saying like, okay, BMW has openings, we're trying to build smart car systems. And so this is the upside of being in a niche. Like, it makes you very, very marketable to people who have that same problem. The downside, of course, is then you are basically making the bet that the supply is going to continue to exist. I have seen that it tends to support really, really senior ICs that are deep experts, and this is where sort of like if you're a person that wants to become more of an I-shaped engineer, like go really deep in one field, that can really help. One last thought, and I'll bring it to Lauren. You do have to get really good at evaluating companies for what they can offer you and what support for your role is going to look like. I think being a specialist means that it's great in terms of pay, but it does mean that you are somewhat at the whims of a company that requires you to do very specific things in a very specific way. All right, Lauren.
Try now? Okay. Same topic. I'm interested, so having hired and run teams that have both highly specialized build engineers and more generalized build engineers, I had one team with one and one team with the other, where there was dispersed knowledge within the group and one where there was a single expert in all things Bazel. Okay? I'm curious, it seems like when you are that person and that sort of job is a lasting one, you have a lot of leverage, and that is a good thing. But it's also really hard to be a bus factor, it's hard to take vacations, it's hard to build a team around you, and so you can often have to solve the entire stack of problems in that space yourself, as opposed to be able to delegate and things like that. So I'm curious, when you choose to specialize that way, what are ways that the care and feeding of those types of engineers changes at companies your size? How do you make sure that they're happy for the long term? How do you make sure they also get professional development in the next thing and don't get pigeonholed into just being the expert in the now without being able to focus on the next two? I'm curious about how you approach that.
Okay, so I think the question sounded like, if you are one of these engineers who is a deep expert in one area and you get hired in, how do you ensure that you're in a place where you're adequately being utilized and that you're able to translate these skills and the rest of the team is able to, you're not becoming that single point of failure. And you're able, okay. I think that there's two parts to this, and I think some of this is the IC level itself, because at one level, the fundamental engineering skills are the things that are always translatable. And so if you are a deep expert and you're in a field and you're hired to do a particular job, then obviously that's great. What happens after that? What happens when the job changes around you and when the company changes around you, right? And having that flexibility, the ability to adapt to, for example, being able to transition from being a specialist to more of a generalist and back again is great. And this is obviously the whole idea of the T-shaped developer, where you do have your one deep area of expertise, but you have the breadth to be able to move across when needed. And that can give you a bit more of flexibility, because otherwise you could find that a lot of the skills that you have brought, that you were hired to bring on, become redundant. The other thing is from the hiring manager's point of view, or from somebody who is looking at it from the team. A lot of companies choose to do this by building an entire team around that specialty. So for example, you will build a whole DevOps team and you're hiring a DevOps person to be part of that team. And that means you have proven that this need exists, and this need has continued to exist at this company for a long time, and that's what's sustaining this team for so long. And typically hiring is the answer to, we have so much stuff to do that we actually need the extra person indefinitely to do this work. The other thing I think is the ability to do knowledge transfer from specialists is something that I haven't heard about as much, but I think should be done more, or at least we need to build a way to bridge specialists to generalists in any company, because that's good utilization of engineering skill set. So all of this is really, at its core, it's about engineering efficiency. It's about where you want to put investment into a particular skill set or a particular engineer or a particular team so that you get efficiency gains across a large amount of people, right? And so being able to build a system where the specialists are not the point of failure and they are not the bottleneck for the rest of the org is really critical. And there actually has been a lot of literature on this. So for example, it's a pretty typical platform team problem that they end up being the people who are responsible for XYZ, and they are overloaded with requests and or they're not able to handle inbound requests from, for example, your product teams. And so there's a couple choices here, and that is one, a lot of companies have done this. You could choose to actually have specialists embedded in each particular team, and so you have more of a distributed approach. But that still means that your bottlenecking problem still exists. It just exists at the team level instead of the org level. The other thing is to, at least for, and I've seen this done at Square, is for your platform teams or your specialist teams, quote unquote, to become more mentors and guides for teams to essentially self-serve platform work. And that can work really well when there is a large amount of work that needs to be done that is basically, for example, a migration. Often you have a platform team who is designing the path for a migration or is defining a proven path for a migration, or, for example, creates a framework or a tool to execute this migration. But the actual work of this is essentially farmed out to a product team. At Square, I've heard this referred to as a farm versus grind culture, where the grind is essentially your specialist team is executing that particular project or that particular job, and they're essentially the only ones grinding away at this. Pluses and minuses of this is that your platform teams tend to always feel like they're suffering, and they are paying down, often they are the ones paying down the tech debt of other people. That's not a pattern that you want to repeat in your org, because that is it leads to burnout, and it means that you have some engineers who are always having a great time and working really fast, and some engineers who are like tech debt all the time, everywhere, and they're drowning in it. And so the farm versus grind thinking balances out the fact that, like, sometimes you do need to have one person or a set of people grinding away at a problem, or it's a way for them to farm out the problem to multiple teams, and that way what you have is you are solving the problem, you're using the specialist to solve the problem, but you are delegating the execution in parallel to multiple people, and that can be a much faster and easier way of executing large, gnarly things like migrations, for example. Another way that I have seen this done is sort of in a commons approach, where we essentially all agree that everybody in the org or everybody in the company is going to be responsible for maintaining their commons. And this is something that could lead to a tragedy of the commons problem, where, like, collectively people think like, oh, it's not my problem, it's everybody's problem, and so therefore maybe I don't feel like I want to go around fixing it. I think I have seen it work, though, in cultures where we inculcate high ownership, high agency, and essentially are rewarding the fact that, like, people are jumping in to fix specialist problems. And this is actually interesting because it leads us to the structure where instead of investing in specialists, you invite all of your generalists to develop specialist skills of their own. And so essentially, backing up a little bit, the main function of the business is to deliver value to the customer, right? Whether that customer is your end user or your engineers themselves. And so what you can do is have your engineers focus on that customer and take on all of the tasks that need to be done. And that can be feature delivery, but it can also be tech debt management, it can also be build optimization, for example. And if engineers are empowered enough to take on the work of maintaining or developing the commons in a high agency environment, I think that works really well as well. And that sort of sidesteps the problem of, like, oh, we have a build or DevOps problem, but we don't have the person who can fix it. And so it means that hiring is not really the blocker to solving certain problems. It means that you are essentially training a very flexible set of engineers that can adapt to whatever problem the company is facing at the moment. It does mean that as companies go through phases, for example, there are times when you may have a company that's really focused on go-to-market and is just really racing on feature delivery and velocity, experimentation, all that stuff. Or you may have a company that's focused on a resiliency phase and focused more on getting rid of tech debt and speeding things up. And sometimes it's the same company has to go through these phases in different time frames. So for example, if you go to market and you've captured a market segment and you're trying to essentially make this a better experience, you're shifting from a high velocity culture to a resiliency culture. And it really helps to have a workforce that is able to adapt from a generalist, hands-on, let's everybody doing the same work to let's maintain the commons together and solve problems. And so there's always pros and cons, I think, and it's been interesting to see different companies solving things different ways. There's also the consideration that as an IC, that specializing can go a little bit too far, or it can create a comfort zone where you tend to operate without needing to care about, where is the rest of the industry going, or what is going to happen in 5 to 10 years when this particular product or this particular framework that I'm a really good expert in becomes out of date. It can be a really, really good product, but if nobody's using it, then it doesn't serve you to be the subject matter expert there. So I think at the org level, it becomes a lot about the trade-offs of what are your business needs, and as a body of, if you look at your engineering org as like a collection of people and a collection of skills, how do you have a more fungible skill set that can be applied to any business problem that you're dealing with? Okay, and I'm going to pause there for Tasha.
Okay, awesome. Oh, is it on? Can you hear me? Oh, cool. So I've experienced this phenomenon with specialists where they kind of go into this pigeonhole space and they try to apply the specializations from one area to others where it's not applicable at all. And so they kind of try to be generalist when they clearly are very specialist, and they kind of create this strange sort of culture of I don't know if I can trust this because you're offering tools from one area into another area and they're not always translatable, or the expertise is very different. Do you have any sort of advice or ideas on how to kind of navigate specialists who are very interested in their specialization, but they're trying to apply it or kind of strong-arm it into other areas?
Okay, so the question was, how do you deal with specialists who are trying to apply their specialized solution to general areas? And I think the subtext of your question is that specialists often tend to be really, really senior and very experienced, and often at higher levels in the company. And so it's harder, for example, if you see a specialist trying to apply a solution that doesn't fit or feels shoehorned or feels difficult to work with for other people, it becomes difficult to sort of adjust that behavior because they are so senior, and it's assumed that this level of expertise applies to everything, right? There's cultural ways, I think, of handling this problem, and first, the primary way would be to build a high trust culture where everybody is empowered to not just help each other grow, but to give feedback, to challenge things like PRs, things like assumptions, things like designs. There has to be a robust culture of feedback, and even, for example, letting your junior engineers be able to ask questions or request changes in PRs is a big deal. Because, and here's the thing, it sounds like a specialist is like one person and then a generalist is another person, but to be honest, most engineers are a mix of the two. A lot of people are generalists because we are engineers. It requires a lot of general engineering skills, and if you've been around as a developer for 5-ish years, by that time you've picked up a lot of different things that you can do. And so even if you are a specialist, you are a specialist in some things probably, and a generalist in some things. And so the awareness, building a culture of being aware of that fact and empowering others to support communication this way really helps. And the other thing is building systems for knowledge transfer, I think. one thing that I've been seeing as like a really interesting use of AI is that it has been encouraging developers to sort of break out of their particular areas of expertise using the AI models to sort of test against or work against. Mike's talk earlier this morning was really interesting because that's what he talked about doing at Airbnb, is building an AI productivity and tooling team where for the first time, like as a mobile engineer, you could build things that were not in the typical purview of mobile specialists. And so I think AI is a good tool to leverage for and encourage just for this particular process of here's how to gain a broader understanding of systems that are outside of your specialty, or at least building knowledge transfer for specialists.
Hello again. I have noticed that a lot of engineers become specialists when they do their staff project. That's when they have kind of chosen or been assigned a problem to solve, and they solve it and become the subject matter expert in an area that was previously unsolved, and now they are that expert. I've also seen that those, when they are successful, they kind of become a sort of double-edged sword of great job stability, great mentorship of others, but the ability to move on to your next idea, like maybe that wasn't your area you really wanted to live in forever. I'm thinking of maybe DI isn't something that you just love eternally, but you really love solving it that one time and maybe two. Have you seen examples of being able to move someone away from that sort of specialty or help them? And often those areas are gnarly for a reason, and so it's hard to find someone else who wants to take that on. I'll give you one example of how we've tried to. Have that person write run books where you can't actually ask that person for help until you have gotten to like the last step of it. It's like, you must try all of these things before you call me. That's often the way, especially when you're deeply embedded. And I'm curious about how AI is going to change that. But do you have examples where maybe you didn't like that path, or you want to transition away from that path, and how you support someone?
Ooh, this is a really interesting one, because right as you said that, here's the thing, a lot of ways, the path that engineers get to staff is often through building deep expertise and demonstrating deep expertise by building certain large, complicated things for your company, or changing large, complicated things at your company. And so what makes you really successful in getting to staff kind of locks you in to that specialty. And sometimes that's great, sometimes it's detrimental. Another thing that I think also influences this is the Will Larson Archetypes book, which was hugely influential in understanding how staff plus engineers operate, and very, very senior people operate, but also suddenly starts creating this framework of like, are you a fixer or are you an architect? XYZ. And then of course there was this old architect role that is still really prevalent in a lot of companies that says like architects do XYZ and don't actually execute. So I think the preconceived notions and patterns of a staff plus career level job sort of very much imply that there is a specialized task or deep expertise being built there. And as for the fact that how are we transitioning people away from this, I think one thing that Square has been working on is actually building in a lot more flexibility into the thinking of like, here is what we consider staff and this is what we consider senior, and here is a variety of ways that we consider successful, like a variety of personas, a varieties of skill sets. We don't just expect staff plus people to be experts in XYZ and have to be like the maintainer of an open source library or writer of an open source library. It's very much about what is that unique thing that you are bringing in terms of business value and organizational impact. And a lot less like, here are the 4 archetypes. So pick which one of the archetypes you would like to be, and please operate in that way. But it's a lot more about creating your own path and building ways to be recognized for contributions that don't fit into a traditional archetype or rubric. So there is a lot of organizational work being done. I think transitioning people from one to the other relies a lot on a culture of safety, of being open with failure, of actually having a culture where people are open to sharing responsibilities. So I think the ownership of projects has to be something that is up for reassignment, for example. So if you were the DI expert at one thing, it doesn't mean that you're taking all the DI projects from now on. So there has been a little bit, I think, of a cultural shift in progress around this concept of what specializations are you expected to take, but also carry forward with you. All right, we have a few minutes, and I know there's a couple people with questions, so go ahead.
Hey, thanks for your chat so far. So I come from system design, like a UI, UX background, but I've also been an Android dev, sort of like the intermediate on path to senior. Early on in a lot of my internships, I've had to like sort of fight and make space to still walk into user interviews or like design review meetings, taking away from my dev work or feature product work. I think it's very beneficial now that I'm working full time and I can like provide that resource. But being on the other side of it, do you think outside of resources, especially at a startup level, I tend to always work at like startups just for the pace, the speed. What kind of tactical things would you recommend to like engineering directors or managers to like allow for people to actually make space while it not affect their performance and feature product development, especially at like a smaller company?
So it sounds like, here's the thing I didn't touch very much on, which is that at smaller companies, there isn't always the space available to do this. It's sort of taken for granted that at larger companies you're going to have a UI system team and a DevOps team, and that's just not a resource available at smaller spaces. And in one thing that I had done at Comcast when I was standing up the first design system that we had was essentially leaning into the business objectives of that year and sort of trying to tie some of those to the purpose of the team. And so a lot of this was around convincing of like, here's your business goal. You want to have X number of users migrating from one app to the other by the end of this year, right? And so that means here's a secondary experience that'll make that easier, and that is App A has got a really great UI system that doesn't translate as well to App B, and so here's where like investment in the UI system could really help. And I'm going to admit, like, this is never an easy conversation, or it requires a lot of persuasion in phases. So a lot of this started with prototyping and taking examples from other companies. A lot of this was taking performance metrics or like cost benefit. I did a lot of reading about what other companies had done to be successful with this exact problem. I think that was decently convincing to at least start with the prototype phase, and that could get enough buy-in to start carving out space to say like, hey, we're successful at this particular project and this particular initiative, or basically proving success at a smaller scope makes the case for this team or this skill set to continue existing at the company. And companies have a lot of inertia because like once a team is there, it's really hard to shut it down. So that also works in our favor a lot of times.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Appreciate it.
Okay, last question.
Hello, how are you doing today? Great conversation so far. Sorry, I know we are out of time, but I'm wondering, I know you've not mentioned this, but how do you deal with stubborn specialists? Because we do have those in our teams. How do you deal with them? Sorry, how do you deal with stubborn specialists?
Is that stubborn specialists? This is a great question because I want to invite people who have been a stubborn specialist or who have worked with stubborn specialists to say this. And again, like I'm going to say, engineers always have strong opinions, and we have all built things that we feel very strongly about. And sometimes it's just a question of incremental progress. Sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's technical, sometimes it's a PR showing that like an alternative approach works. Sometimes it's actually leaning into the business side of things and producing metrics that is like an efficient counter argument to this. And often, I think a lot of times specialists are used to being the subject matter expert and having conversations and investing in knowledge transfer makes a stronger team. So at least you're all speaking the same language, right? Like specialists are used to being the only person who understands this problem, or at least that's what they think they are. And a lot of times, if using the right language does unlock, it does dismantle some of the stubbornness to make the case. Okay, I think we're out of time, but I can hop down and answer your questions later.